The cattle drive had carried Elias Munro far across the dry sweep of the plains, and when at last he turned his horse toward home, the air had the faint bite of autumn. Dust clung to his coat, his hat was heavy with wear, and his bones ached with a kind of fatigue that went deeper than flesh. For weeks, he had dreamed of nothing more than his porch, his chair, and the comfort of silence. Yet as his homestead rose from the horizon, smoke curling from the chimney, he slowed his horse with a frown. There were wagons in his yard, voices he did not know, and figures standing like watchful crows upon his steps. The neighbors had gathered, men and women with stern eyes and voices pitched low in gossip. As Elias dismounted, every gaze turned toward him, a mixture of expectation and unease. At the center of their circle stood a figure smaller than the rest, a young Apache woman, her shawl damp from rain, braids hanging heavy down her shoulders. She did not meet his eye, only fixed her stare on the ground before her, though something in the taut set of her jaw betrayed more fire than defeat. One of the men stepped forward, his tone meant to sound generous. "Thought it best she come here. Better in your keeping than in the hands of soldiers. We reckon you'll know what to do with her." Elias felt the words strike him like stones. His heart, hardened by years of widowhood and the long ache of silence, flinched. They had brought her as though she were an offering, a debt paid in flesh. His jaw tightened. "I don't need gifts," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Not like this. Take her back." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered about kindness, another about debts owed, another about how she'd fare worse elsewhere. Their arguments twisted like dry brush in the wind, but Elias heard only the blood pounding in his ears. His gaze went at last to the woman, who stood utterly still, her blanket pulled tighter around her shoulders. Rain had left dark streaks on her cheeks, though whether from water or tears he could not tell. The neighbors waited for gratitude, for acceptance, but Elias offered none. His silence was sharp enough to cut. At last, with huffs and shakes of heads, the crowd dispersed, boots crunching on wet earth, wagon wheels rolling back toward the road. One by one they vanished, leaving only the hollow echo of their departure. Elias stood in the yard a long while, the reins loose in his hand, the woman unmoving on his porch. He thought of sending her away even then, but the dusk was falling fast, and the prairie night was no place for any soul alone. At last, he motioned her inside with a curt nod. She stepped past him without a word, her eyes sliding across his face like the glance of a hawk before settling once more on the floorboards. The house smelled of old wood smoke and leather. His late wife's rocking chair sat in its corner, untouched these many years, gathering the dust of memory. The woman paused near the hearth, then sank down cross-legged upon the rug, her blanket still wrapped close, as though she meant to make no claim beyond the space at her feet. Elias busied himself with stabling the horse, storing his gear, tending to the cattle, anything to delay the weight pressing inside his chest. When at last he entered again, firelight had begun to glow against the log walls. She had kindled it with quiet efficiency, though she still did not look at him. Elias set his rifle against the door, hung his hat on its peg, and sat heavily at the table. He ate bread and dried meat in silence. She did not ask for food, though he left some upon the table within her reach. He watched, without seeming to, as she waited until he had turned away, then pulled the crust toward her with slow hands. Night thickened. Elias took his bed, though sleep would not come. Across the room, curled near the hearth, the woman lay wrapped in her blanket, her face turned toward the embers. Outside, coyotes sang to the moon, their voices long and mournful. Inside, silence pressed between them, a wall higher than any fence he had built. Staring at the rafters, Elias felt the weight of years settle over him, the memory of his wife's laughter gone, the hollowness of his house, the bitter truth that his armor was loneliness itself. He had thought it strength to live without need. But now, in the quiet presence of a stranger abandoned upon his doorstep, that armor felt heavy, like chains he could no longer set down. The days that followed settled like a thin frost over the ranch, quiet and brittle. The woman moved about the cabin with silent purpose, tending the fire before dawn, mending tears in old shirts, straightening tools that had long lain scattered. She stepped outside often, walking the edges of the pasture, her gaze flicking to the horizon as if measuring the distance between here and somewhere else. Elias watched from the barn, never asking what she sought. He told himself it was only escape she hunted, though sometimes he wondered if she searched instead for memories, the kind only the land could keep. Elias threw himself into work with the cattle, into the rhythm of chopping wood and hauling water, as though effort alone could silence the thoughts that pricked at him. His hands grew cracked in the cold, his back stiffened from long hours bent against the wind. At night, when he sank into the chair at the table, exhaustion brought little rest. The house spoke too loudly of absence. His wife's rocking chair sat motionless on the porch, its creak long gone to memory. Upstairs, in a cedar chest he rarely opened, her wedding dress lay folded, untouched since the day it was placed there. When rain came and tapped on the roof, it carried echoes of laughter that no longer belonged to him. He began to notice the woman's quiet dignity in small ways. The way she drew her braids tight each morning, strands smoothed with care. The way her hands, though scarred, knew their work, grinding corn, steadying a fence post, stitching leather with precision. There was no waste in her movement, no plea for pity. Yet her eyes, when they lifted toward the horizon, carried a depth Elias could not fathom. He wondered what faces haunted her, what voices had been taken from her, what fires she had sat beside before she was left here. They spoke little. His words stumbled in her presence, and though she understood more than he expected, silence always seemed safer. It was a silence Elias both dreaded and depended upon. A bridge of words would have meant facing truths he was not yet ready to face, hers or his own. One evening, the prairie darkened under the weight of a storm. Thunder rolled across the valley, shaking the windows, lightning spilling its raw light over the fields. Inside, the fire burned low, shadows leaping along the walls. Elias sat at the table with his coffee, the woman by the hearth, her head bent as she mended the torn hem of a shirt. A sudden flash lit the room white. In that instant, Elias saw what the dim light had hidden, faint scars running across her wrists, pale lines carved by old wounds. On her arm, beneath the sleeve, he glimpsed the fading yellow of a bruise not yet gone. The sight struck him harder than thunder. She did not flinch under his gaze, though she must have known he had seen. She kept her hand steady, threading the needle, her face calm in its resolve. It was not shame that kept her silent, he realized, but endurance, the practiced stillness of someone who had weathered more storms than she cared to name. Elias's chest tightened, not with pity but with recognition. She was no gift, no prize left on his porch. She was a survivor, cast off and abandoned, just as he had been by fate and grief. In her scars, he saw a reflection of his own invisible wounds, the hollowness that had kept him breathing yet empty, the ache that no labor or season could erase. That night, as the rain hammered the roof, Elias lay awake listening to the wind whip against the walls. Across the room, she slept curled close to the fire, her breathing even. He closed his eyes and felt the weight of silence again, but it no longer seemed a wall. It was a mirror, one that showed him what he had refused to see, that loneliness, borne long enough, becomes its own kind of prison. And here, in the heart of the storm, he realized he was not the only prisoner. Winter came down hard across the valley, burying the land in a stillness so complete it seemed the world itself had gone to sleep. Snow drifted against the fence lines, muffling the crunch of cattle hooves, softening even the harsh edges of the barn roof. Elias worked through it, wrapped in his heavy coat, his breath rising in white plumes. The Apache woman moved quietly within the house, keeping the fire fed, grinding corn into meal, sewing by the window where frost traced pale veins across the glass. Their days slid by in silence, a rhythm as steady as the ticking of the clock on the mantel. One evening, as the light failed early and the wind began to howl, Elias saw a rider on the horizon. The figure bent low over his horse, wrapped in a long coat dusted white with snow. By the time the stranger reached the yard, night had nearly fallen, and the storm was tightening its grip. Elias, bound by the hard laws of frontier decency, stepped outside and waved him in. The man dismounted with an easy grin that came too quick, the kind of smile that asked for trust even as it betrayed itself. He carried a rifle slung across his back, boots worn but restless with energy. "Storm's coming on fierce," he said. "Hope you've room for one more by the fire." Elias gave a curt nod, motioning him inside. The warmth of the hearth met them, the Apache woman turning her head briefly from where she sat, shawl drawn close around her shoulders. The stranger's eyes found her at once, and lingered. Elias felt the weight of that gaze but said nothing, only brushed the snow from his coat and set about ladling stew into a tin bowl. The meal was eaten in brittle quiet. The stranger filled it with his own voice, boasting of trails he'd ridden, men he'd shot, women he'd known. He laughed as he spoke of campaigns against savages, his words thick with pride and cruelty. "A bullet don't lie," he said, slamming his empty cup on the table. "Best kind of justice there is." Elias listened in silence, jaw hard, spoon motionless in his hand. The woman sat close to the fire, her face turned away, but her shoulders stiffened with every word. The stranger's smile grew meaner when he noticed. He leaned back in his chair, stretching long legs, and his hand reached lazily toward the dark braid that lay against her shoulder. The room seemed to narrow in an instant. Elias's chair scraped against the floor as he rose. His rifle, resting by the door, was in his hand before the man's fingers could close on the braid. The air thickened with danger, the howl of the wind outside pressing against the walls as though the storm itself were holding its breath. The stranger froze, eyes flicking to the barrel pointed his way. A slow smile crept back, though it no longer touched his eyes. "Didn't mean offense," he drawled, voice thin. "Just being friendly." Elias said nothing. His silence was harder than any words, sharper than the steel of the rifle. The stranger laughed low in his throat, then stood, spreading his hands as though to show he meant no harm. But the message was clear enough in the cold set of Elias's stare. The storm raged through the night. The man stretched out on the floor near the door, his back to the wall, though Elias knew well he slept little. Elias himself remained wakeful, sitting by the dying fire, his rifle never far from reach. The woman lay curled beneath her shawl, but once, in the hush between thunder and wind, he thought he saw her eyes open, watching. At dawn, the storm broke, leaving the land draped in white silence. The stranger saddled his horse without hurry, his grin returned, though his words carried an edge now. "Mighty fine place you've got," he said. "Would be a shame if trouble came knockin'." With that, he tipped his hat and rode into the pale distance, leaving tracks that vanished quickly under drifting snow. Elias stood at the doorway, watching until the figure was swallowed by the land. When he turned, the woman was standing near the hearth, shawl still clutched around her. For the first time since she had come to his house, she met his gaze and held it. Her eyes were dark and unreadable, yet something had shifted, the faintest acknowledgement, a fragile trust. Elias felt the change settle in him like embers that, once nearly gone, began to glow again. Winter held fast to the land, tightening its grip until each day felt like a test of endurance. The ranch became a crucible, its walls containing two silences that circled one another without touch or resolution. Elias rose early, stepping out into the frozen dawn, his boots crunching through ice-crusted snow, his breath white and ragged in the air. He split wood, hauled water, and worked the cattle pens with hands stiffened by the cold. Inside, she tended the hearth with quiet care, grinding corn on the worn stone, stitching old shirts until the seams grew strong again, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. At times, he would pass the window and see her rocking slowly in the chair that had once belonged to his wife. The sight struck him like a blow, familiar, and yet utterly changed. Little by little, gestures began to pass between them, wordless but undeniable. A cup of coffee left waiting on the table, steam still curling into the air when he came in from the fields. A shawl, folded neatly and placed over the back of his chair by the fire. A length of fence, long broken, found mended without his asking. They were small things, almost nothing, yet they carried the weight of recognition. Elias felt the beginnings of a bridge forming, though he did not yet have the courage to step upon it. At night, guilt gnawed at him. To accept her presence felt like betrayal, like laying his wife's memory aside, as though love could be replaced as easily as setting down one garment to take up another. But to send the woman away, into the snow and the dangers of men and wilderness, felt like condemning her to death. Between these truths, Elias lay restless in his bed, his thoughts a constant grind like the creak of a wagon wheel on a long road. Some nights, when the fire burned low and silence wrapped the cabin, he heard her muffled weeping through the blankets. He turned his face to the wall, shame biting deeper than the cold. It was wolves that broke the stalemate between them. One night, the cattle bawled in panic, their cries rising sharp into the still air. Elias leapt from bed, rifle in hand, and rushed into the storm-dark yard. The beasts had come down from the hills, hunger driving them close, eyes glinting pale in the lantern light. Shots cracked across the snow, sharp as splitting wood. Elias fired again and again, but the pack pressed close, darting in shadows. Suddenly she was beside him, torch blazing in her hand, the firelight painting her face in fierce lines. She swung the flame with precision, driving the wolves back, their snarls breaking into yelps as they scattered. Together they moved as if guided by some unspoken accord, his rifle steady, her fire quick and sure, until the last of the pack slunk away into the darkness, leaving only blooded snow and the wild sound of cattle still settling in their pen. When it was done, they stood panting in the frozen night, the torch crackling, smoke rising into the starlit sky. Elias turned to her, chest heaving, his breath clouding in the cold. For the first time, their eyes met not as strangers, not as captor and cast-off, but as two who had faced death side by side and lived. The silence that followed was heavy but no longer empty. It brimmed with something neither could name. At last, Elias spoke, his voice rough, uncertain. "Your name," he said quietly. She hesitated, then whispered it into the night, the sound soft but clear, carried on the cold air between them. He repeated it, tasting the shape of it on his tongue as though it were both foreign and familiar, a word he had needed without knowing. And in that moment, with the snow at their feet and the smoke rising, a fragile truce was born. Spring came slow but certain, loosening winter's grip until the land sighed with thaw. Snow pulled back into the gullies, creeks spilled cold water down their stony beds, and shoots of green pressed bravely through the softened earth. On mornings when the sun warmed the porch, Elias worked at the sagging boards, replacing what rot had taken, his hammer ringing sharp in the open air. Nearby, she knelt by the doorway, planting herbs in the dark soil, her fingers careful and steady. She hummed under her breath as she worked, soft, lilting notes of a tune Elias did not know. At first he pretended not to hear, but more than once he caught himself pausing, the sound filling some hollow place in him he had thought long closed. The days carried small exchanges that became bridges across their silence. Elias taught her words: sky, horse, fire, rain. She repeated them slowly, her voice quiet but sure. In turn, she taught him an Apache prayer for the coming rains, her syllables flowing like water, his own tongue clumsy but earnest as he tried to follow. When she laughed at his misstep, a quick, surprised sound, Elias felt something stir in him that he had not felt in years. At night, the firelight glowed gentler, no longer harsh with suspicion but warm with the fragile thread of trust. She no longer curled far from him on the floor but sat nearer, shawl drawn about her shoulders, her gaze steady when it met his. The silence between them had changed. It no longer pressed, it breathed. But peace in the west never lasted. One evening, as Elias returned from checking the far pasture, he saw them on the ridge, riders, 4 in all, with the drifter at their head. His grin was the same, but his eyes had grown harder, his hand easy on the rifle at his side. They descended slow, as if to remind him how little choice he had. Their words were cruelly simple: land could be taken, women claimed, old men driven aside. Elias felt the weight of years in his bones then, the truth that his strength was not what it once had been. Yet when he looked at her, standing in the doorway with her shawl gathered tight but her eyes fierce and unafraid, something steadied in him. She was no longer the silent burden left on his porch. She was his equal, and he knew it with a certainty that burned away doubt. That evening, as the sun bled out across the sky, they sat together in the cabin, the fire throwing long shadows on the walls. He rose without a word and crossed to the cedar chest. From it he drew the shawl that had once belonged to his wife, soft wool, faded by time, still carrying the faintest scent of cedar. He turned and placed it gently around the woman's shoulders. Her eyes widened, her hands brushing the fabric, but she did not pull away. He said nothing of replacement, nothing of forgetting. The gesture was not one of erasure but of respect, a vow that she belonged here not as a gift abandoned but as a woman chosen, honored. She met his gaze, steady and unwavering, and in the quiet that followed, the truth between them was clear. No words of love passed, yet it was there, undeniable as the fire's glow. It was born not of haste or hunger but of survival, of shared silence, of the courage to begin again when both had thought life had ended. Outside, the wind carried the promise of storm and threat, but within those walls, something stronger had taken root. Dawn came like a knife, cutting through the stillness with the crack of rifles. Elias was awake before the first shot split the valley, his body answering to danger as if it had been waiting all night. The drifter and his men rode in hard from the east, the rising sun at their backs, shadows long against the frost-glittered grass. Bullets tore splinters from the fence posts, sent cattle bawling wild into the pasture. Elias grabbed his rifle from the wall, his breath steady though his heart pounded like a drum. She was beside him before he could speak, her dark eyes burning, her hands quick as she took up a blade and a torch from the hearth. He wanted to tell her to stay back, to hide, but the words died. This was not a woman who waited to be saved. She had been fighting for her life long before she ever came to his door. The yard erupted in chaos. Elias dropped one man from his saddle with a shot clean through the chest. Another circled wide, firing wildly, bullets thudding against the cabin walls. She darted through the smoke, torch blazing, and set dry hay alight in the path of the riders. The fire roared sudden and fierce, spooking horses, breaking their charge. The drifter's laugh cut through it all, ugly, mocking, as he dismounted and advanced on foot, rifle ready. Elias stood his ground, shoulders squared despite the ache in his bones. They traded fire in the yard, each shot echoing across the valley like thunder. The woman moved swift at Elias's side, her blade flashing once, twice, when a man broke through with pistol drawn. Blood hit the snow, steaming. She did not flinch. The fight raged until the land itself seemed to rise, dust, smoke, and fire swirling with a storm of gunpowder and shouts. Then, as sudden as it began, silence pressed down. The drifter staggered back, eyes wide in disbelief as Elias's last bullet found its mark. He fell heavy into the dirt, his rifle clattering useless beside him. Around them, the others lay scattered, the valley scarred with fire and death. Elias's rifle slipped from his hand. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the porch, breath ragged, blood seeping from a crease along his ribs. The woman was there in an instant, her hands strong and certain. She tore strips from her dress, binding his wound tight. Her face hovered close to his, lined with dirt and smoke, her expression unreadable yet fiercely present. They said nothing. Words would have been too small. Survival itself was their vow. By midday, neighbors arrived, drawn by the gunfire, by the smoke rising on the horizon. They reined in their horses, their eyes wide as they took in the bodies strewn across the yard, the blackened scars of fire on the grass. Elias slumped against the porch rail with the woman kneeling beside him. Murmurs rose, sharp with judgment, heavy with unspoken questions. But Elias stood, though his body trembled with exhaustion. He drew her up beside him, his hand steady on hers. His voice, when it came, was calm, firm as iron. He named her, not as a prize abandoned at his door, not as a stranger under his roof, but as his wife. The words cut clean through the crowd. No one spoke against him. In the silence that followed, they could only bow their heads and turn their horses back toward the horizon. That evening, as the valley quieted once more, Elias saddled 2 horses. She mounted without hesitation, her shawl drawn close against the cooling wind. Together, they rode the pasture, the land stretched wide and scarred beneath the fading light. The sun sank slow, setting the sky ablaze in fire and ash, yet soft, as if the world itself was granting them reprieve. Elias watched her riding beside him, the curve of her shoulders strong against the glow. He felt the ache of years in his bones, but also something else, a weight lifted, a second chance he had never thought would come. He had not been given a burden. He had been given a partner, a flame that endured the storm, a life returned where there had once been only silence. The prairie wind rose around them, carrying off the last smoke of battle. Home, he thought. Not just walls and fences, but this, 2 souls, once abandoned, riding side by side into whatever days remained.